I couldn't look you in the eyes. You're just like an angel, and your skin makes me cry. And you float like
camera lens zooms in on Minsk tonight. The cables run deep through the snow and the light. From the other side we're broadcasting the truth between the old guard and the tech-driven youth. Red lines on a digital map, waiting for the signal to snap. Red lines on a digital map, wait for the signal to snap. Kiev is cold and the borders are tight. The dragon looks west while the eagle takes flight. NATO is moving like gears in a clock. Sanctions are falling like rain on the rock. Red lines on a digital map, wait for the signal to snap. Red lines on a digital map, wait for the signal to snap. Silicon brains making plans for the front. The diplomats argue, the soldiers are blunt. A world in a loop, a world in a spin. Where does the news end and the future begin? Red lines on a digital map, wait for the signal to snap. Red lines on a digital map, wait for the signal to snap. Side. The feed is going dark. Live from the other side. The feed is going dark. Live from the other side.
And before we continue tonight's show, a quick word from our tonight's sponsor, the Quantum Hemispheres, The Rise of ARCO. A near-future geopolitical sci-fi novel exploring energy systems, artificial intelligence, information control, collapsing institutions, and the silent infrastructure replacing the modern world while politicians continue arguing about yesterday's headlines. If you enjoy the topics we discuss on this show, technocracy, global systems, power structures, escalation, and the future of civilization, then this book is written for you. Quantum Hemispheres, The Rise of ARCO, available now on Amazon in paperback and Kindle. All right, everybody, welcome to live show 177, The Power Convergence, broadcasting live from Minsk, Belarus tonight. And tonight we'll be breaking down the converging crises, now reshaping the global system, economic instability, censorship and information control, technocracy and artificial intelligence, resource wars, NATO escalation, and the growing collapse of diplomacy between major powers. Joining us tonight is a special guest, Jesse Winney from No2NATO. And throughout the show, we'll be discussing some of the biggest geopolitical developments unfolding right now across Europe, Russia, the United States, China, and the wider international system. And what a week it's been. Putin travelled to China this week, where Moscow and Beijing signed new agreements covering trade, energy, and what both sides openly described as a move towards a multipolar world order beyond the US dominance Even Bloomberg is now openly warning that China increasingly sees Russia as a key partner in challenging American global hegemony over the long term. At the same time, nuclear rhetoric continues escalating across Europe. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte admitted the alliance is monitoring a major Russian and Belarusian nuclear exercises here, while Lukashenko responded by warning that NATO must understand the risks of escalation when involving itself directly in a proxy war against Russia. Meanwhile, the United States carried out another Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile test across the Pacific, while Britain reportedly conducted a classified World War III simulation against Russia inside a secret NATO bunker beneath London. Completely normal civilizational behavior, obviously. Meanwhile, Lukashenko continues insisting Belarus does not want war with Ukraine, while simultaneously warning that if Belarus is attacked, we won't be polite. And perhaps one of the funniest stories of the week, remember all the headlines accusing Belarus of conducting hybrid warfare against Lithuania using balloons allegedly crossing the border? Well, now Lithuanian authorities have arrested 13 Lithuanian law enforcement officers as part of a major smuggling investigation involving those same balloons. Around 27 people, Lithuanians, have already been arrested, and roughly 50 more suspects, Lithuanians, are under investigation, and millions of euros worth of property has been reportedly been seized. Apparently, Belarus was conducting hybrid warfare against Lithuania using Lithuanians. Wonderful journalism once again. So tonight we'll be breaking all this down alongside our major show topics with Jesse from No to NATO. Let's begin. All right, ladies and gentlemen, joining us tonight on live show 177 is Jesse Winney from No to NATO. We're going to be discussing some of the biggest geopolitical, economic and technological developments unfolding right now, from NATO escalation and the collapse of diplomacy to censorship systems, technocracy, resource wars, and the wider restructuring of the global order. Jesse, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Dave. Really excited to be on.
For viewers who may not know you yet, introduce yourself a little bit, explain what NATO is about, the kind of work and analysis you do, and where people can find both you and No to NATO. And all of Jesse's social media and links will be in the description below.
Yeah, so like I said, David, my social media links are there, so you can find out about me and all my weird and wacky views. So No to NATO started as a campaign a few years ago, launched by George Galloway, his capacity as the leader of the Workers' Party of Britain and a stalwart anti-NATO and anti-war campaigner and prominent parliamentarian for many years now. I'm sure most of you viewers know who George Galloway is. We have voices from the left and the right. You know, furthest to the right, we have David Clues, who's the host of the Unity News Network in Britain, one of the true insurrectionary right-wing voices in our country.
He's been on this show a couple of times.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, absolutely. He's a real ally of our cause. We even have David Miller, who's a prominent activist for solidarity with Palestine, an anti-Zionist scholar, and Chris Williamson, again, a long-time parliamentarian, and many, many thousands more supporters who we seek to get active.
From the other side, the feed is going dark.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin tonight with what might actually be one of the biggest hidden economic disasters unfolding anywhere in the Western world. According to politicians, everything is apparently fantastic. GDP numbers, stock markets, property prices, bank profits. And yet millions of younger people across Britain, Canada, Australia, and much of Europe increasingly cannot afford homes, cannot build long-term stability, and increasingly feel economically locked out of their own countries. That contradiction matters because over the last 30 years, large parts of the West quietly stopped functioning like productive industrial economies and slowly transformed into giant property speculation systems. Everything became centered around protecting asset prices, not manufacturing, not infrastructure, not energy expansion, not industrial development, but property. Governments encouraged it through cheap credit, low interest rates, migration-driven demand, tax incentives, and endless mortgage expansion. The banks loved it because the housing debt became the safest collateral in the economy. Politicians loved it because rising house prices created the illusion of prosperity. But underneath that illusion, economies weakened. Factories were never built. Infrastructure aged. Industrial capacity declined. Younger generations accumulated debt instead of wealth. And eventually, entire societies became trapped because governments could no longer allow property prices to fall significantly without risking financial instability. This is why many Western economies increasingly look wealthy on paper while becoming structurally weaker underneath. Meanwhile, countries like China continue building ports, energy systems, manufacturing ecosystems, and strategic infrastructure. One side builds productive systems, the other side speculates on housing stock. And then the politicians act surprised that productivity stagnates. The danger is not simply housing affordability. The danger is that entire nations are losing the ability to build anything else. So, Jesse, do you think Western governments now depend politically on permanent rising property prices?
Well, in the short term, they do, because that's effectively what fuels the system that propels them into power. It fuels the pockets of their donors. And, that's wonderful for them because they get all the favors, they get all the political power, they can lead nice, cushy lives whilst selling out the interests of their population. The only issue is that you can only keep that charade going for so long. Eventually, the bubble is going to burst again. We are seeing it burst. People are going to lose their jobs en masse, especially with the drive to war against Russia and China. And you've already touched on it. We are losing our industrial capacity. And what do you need to fight a war? You need industrial capacity to fight a war. Russia has that. NATO countries do not. Our fueling of, sorry to go on a tangent on Ukraine, but our fueling of the Ukraine war machine against Russia has already exhausted European supply lines. It really would now take heavier American intervention, which is being stopped by Trump at this moment, for this moment in time. So the whole charade is going to fall. But right now, our Western leaders are very comfortable living lives completely divorced from ordinary people. And I think a great example of that is the situation of mass migration. So again, our politicians can brag about these very impressive GDP, well, not so very impressive GDP numbers, but they're being held stable largely because of mass migration into our countries. You could only imagine if we just cut mass migration entirely, how steep the GDP figures are going to go down. Now, okay, you're keeping GDP figures, hunky-dory, but where's GDP per capita going? And that's the real key thing, because GDP per capita is obviously the best measurement that determines how well we're going to live, and that's only when you gloss over income inequality. But we're seeing GDP per capita go down. So effectively, we are all poorer, and we're enduring mass migration. So the economy on paper is doing well from that. But we, as ordinary working people in this country, are doing terribly. We have more immigrants who are undercutting terms and conditions and wages at work. This isn't a rant about immigrants, by the way. Nobody should be blaming immigrants. We are blaming a system of mass migration that's undercutting us all. We have that. We have more pressure on social services and social infrastructure. And really, we also have very unsafe streets. So the prerogatives of our politicians are completely detached from our own prerogatives. And that's the real problem in our economy. It's an economy, but for who?
So at what point does a housing crisis become a national security issue?
It's really when the bubble bursts, that's when it's going to happen. I mean, we're already probably going to see it as a security issue, because as more of us have less stake in the economy, well, how are you going to recruit a population that has very little stake in how the system operates? People are going around streets asking, would you fight for Britain in a war against Ukraine? And they say no, because the system doesn't actually provide for them. And one of the key aspects of that is housing. when you have an economy that's bent on housing speculation, the ladder is too high for ordinary people who work not even a minimum wage job, but a median wage job to climb. Now, that situation is eroding our national security. I just dread to think when the bubble bursts, as it did back in 2008, and it will again very soon, there'll be huge social upheaval in this country as these bubbles only get worse. They don't get better. They don't peter out. And that's only going to do favors for people on the other side in the BRICS countries who have built more sustainable economic infrastructure that isn't based on speculation. Countries like the country you're in, Belarus, but is actually based on building industrial capacity and is not sold hook, line, and sinker to the neoliberal model that has created housing speculation.
Yeah. Are younger generations beginning to lose faith in the Western economic model itself?
Absolutely. Like I said, they're not willing to fight for it. Our politicians are talking now about a conscription campaign. We've never had to have conscription for the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War. And that's because we could recruit young people quite well. We had what could only be described as a milder version of the post-war consensus in the 1900s with Tony Blair's Third Way. It looked like the economy was working for ordinary people, even though it absolutely wasn't back then, and it certainly isn't now. There was enough to give people the illusion that this system works for them. Every young person, young or old, has a stake in the economy. And that's why we could recruit people for these wars very well. And people were very easily sold on the belief that these wars were humanitarian campaigns. Now, our governments can't even look after us in a humane way. So how on earth do you sell us that our governments are going to look after other people in a humane way? So that illusion's now shattered. And that's why you have people like Paulette Hamilton, an MP the MP for Birmingham and Edgbaston, saying we need conscription. Loads of other politicians are saying we need conscription to fight the Russian bear rampaging across the world. And if we are gearing up for a war, that's going to happen. So young people are in their millions rejecting the status quo. And I think we see this in the rise of alternative parties like the Green Party and the Reform Party. Now, I mean, people like you and I know that these parties are fundamentally establishment parties, but it's indicative of a disgust with the mainstream establishment and what it's done to our country, which is a good thing in of itself. But now we're on the struggle of exposing forces like the Greens and Reform as establishment operations.
Mm-hmm. Is the West deindustrializing itself while competitors continue building productive capacity?
Absolutely. You look at ore in countries like Belarus, Russia, China. Heck, go even further, even North Korea, with it has its industrial base and employs its own people, and in return gives them healthcare, education, and better housing. Like if people in the West are now envying countries like North Korea, it shows you that there's something very profound going on. So, I mean, I'm very happy to have my coordinator role for the World Youth Festival in Russia, where I lead delegations of young people from Britain to go and see Russia. And they just marvel. They just don't see anything like this in the careers fairs in Britain. They see a bonanza of opportunity in Russian universities teaching English courses with guaranteed jobs out of it. Joining the Russian army in the special military operation isn't the only way you can get citizenship to Russia. There's lots and lots more opportunities in these countries. And, these countries actually want us to go over there and study there, work there, China as well. Russia is now the land of opportunity. I mean, you have to look at the United States and see a complete dearth of any industrial capacity. seeing fent-addicted zombies infest the streets, putting up tents. I mean, does that look like, the land of the free, the home of the brave, and the land of opportunity? Absolutely not. It's BRICS countries that are making serious moves to de-dollarize, which will only exacerbate the problems of countries that are in NATO and in the neoliberal Washington order, whilst their countries are on the up. But that's not because China and Russia want us to do poorly. It's because they want their own countries to do well. We just need now a political elite that wants our own country to do well and is committed to breaking from the neoliberal order and moving towards the BRICS model and focus on reindustrializing. Even Russia, many years ago, is now going back on the path of renationalizing key industry. Putin originally was a man who was quite sold on the idea of this new international order of Washington, of NATO, of collective security. But the betrayal of Washington and the European Union totally disillusioned Putin from that world order. And that's why Putin, who's more committed to Russia and the Russian people rather than these elusive universalist models, is setting his country on the path of regaining its economic sovereignty, it already has, and reindustrializing. And that's what we need for our own country.
From the other side, the feed is going dark.
Now let's move from economic control to information control. Australia has launched another government commission around anti-Semitism and social cohesion. And whenever governments start talking about social cohesion, you should immediately pay attention. Because the real issue here is not simply hate speech, it's authority. Western institutions are facing a legitimacy crisis. Public trust in governments, media, universities, corporations, and political systems has collapsed across much of the West. And the old internet shattered the old model where a small number of institutions controlled public narratives. Before the internet, legacy media and political gatekeepers largely controlled the information flow. Now millions of people can publish independently. Alternative media can compete directly with the institutional narratives, and governments increasingly view this as destabilizing. That's why speech is no longer merely framed as offensive. It's increasingly framed as socially dangerous. Once disagreement becomes a threat to cohesion, censorship can be repackaged as public safety, and governments often do this indirectly, through banks, through payment processes, through algorithms, through hosting companies, through advertising restrictions. People can economically be erased without formal bans. Meanwhile, many of the tensions now blamed on speech were intensified by institutional failures themselves: economic decline, political distrust, censorship controversies, and social fragmentation. The more aggressively institutions attempt to control discussion and more they reinforce public suspicion. Because censorship rarely restores legitimacy, it usually accelerates distrust. And that is the larger battle now unfolding across the West. Who controls the modern public square? Governments and technocratic systems, or ordinary citizens communicating outside institutional control? Jesse, are governments increasingly treating uncontrolled speech as a threat to political stability?
Absolutely, and I think you've touched on the most pertinent example of this, that is the government's going hell for leather in protecting Zionism and the state of Israel. And I want to be very clear, this is not because the government has a soft spot for Jews as opposed to anyone else. It's really because Israel performs a very useful function for our elites, and that is being its primary outpost in the Middle East, and suppressing any resistance and any insurrectionary force in the Middle East against our elite's agenda for the people of the Middle East. And unfortunately, that's worked to a large extent. We've seen the fall of Iraq. We've seen the fall of Syria. We've seen the fall of Libya. And now we are seeing our government's siege on Iran, which Israel is fully behind. And Israel plays a vital role in all of this. And that is why our government deifies Zionism and the Jewish community in Britain as opposed to anyone else. This is nothing against Jews, but isn't it odd how when Muslims, who represent 10% roughly of the UK population, as opposed to Jews who, to my knowledge, are not even 1%, maybe a percent at best, when it's Muslims who are electing their representatives into parliament, which they should as 10% of the population, and they do need their voice, that's called sectarianism. But Muslims don't have their own police. The British government are not inviting any military force from the Middle East to protect Muslims, but they're doing all that for the Jews of Golders Green. And it makes you wonder where our government's commitment is. So on the face of it, it sounds like our government has a soft spot for Jews, but it's got nothing to do with Jews. It doesn't matter if the state of Israel's religion is Scientology or Rastafarianism. It's performing a crucial role for our elites, and that's why it's being protected. Now, increasingly, the government is wrestling against the fact that it's us, the public, that have a better control over information, that information is democratized. I was reading an article about how suicidal people who work for TikTok are. They are spending all day doom scrolling, against their own will, by the way, to try and remove content, and they're exposed to very graphic content that probably shouldn't be aired on TikTok. But they're also now being given the role of political police, and this is causing a huge problem with the government because they can only do so good a job, but they cannot. No one can put a lid on what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank. All of this is a genocide and ethnic cleansing being live streamed to your phone at the comfort of your own home. And when it's the elite, and when the elite tries to gaslight you and say, "Oh no, there's a much more complicated issue. There's many sides to this conflict. Blah 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 blah," then that creates a huge level of public distrust in government institutions and, crucially, the mainstream media. And that's why the BBC have toppled. That is why people are going to the internet to look up these views. That is why the government were very desperate to get RT off our telly box, and this creates a huge crisis of information for the government. And now, amidst all the censorship and the greater repression that our government are imposing on us, it's fundamentally good because it shows that actually people are waking up, their consciousness is being lifted, and that is creating more of a challenge for our elites to preserve their hold over our countries than that are ruling our countries against our own interests. And we see this in the election of Donald Trump and the rise of the MAGA movement in Britain. We saw this with Brexit. We saw this with the election of George Galloway. We saw this with the wholesale rejection of mainstream parties in Britain. So it's having this was previously the dark corners of the internet, but we're seeing these so-called dark corners of the internet have very real implications for the political situation at home.
Is censorship now being outsourced through corporations and infrastructure?
Absolutely. So we have the example of TikTok. The dictatorship is now privatized, really. So all these companies are being subject to huge pressure from the government to enforce state repression. We're seeing pushback from Rumble, which was quite good. I really enjoyed the letter sent to the UK culture minister by the CEO of Rumble, politely giving him the two fingers up. So there are very heroic acts of resistance by some media outlets, and those outlets need to be promoted and uplifted. But there are also other corporations that are much more institutionalized, and that could be from infiltration by the Secret Service. So the dictatorship is privatized, but it's still very much controlled by the state. It's the Secret Service that is embedded in Google, YouTube, Facebook. I mean, I don't know to what extent this is happening with Twitter. It looks like Elon Musk, and as much as I have my several differences with Elon Musk, it looks like he is upholding a free speech platform on X. I hope it continues. I'm not sure how long our elites will permit it to continue. Though you've got a very embarrassing outlet called Blue Sky, which is almost unashamedly state-backed safe space for people. But you know, who joins that? Like like the only people who join that have like an LGBTQ lanyard, and those are the only people on Blue Sky. So I don't think we need to worry too much about that.
Yeah. Why hasn't institutional trust collapsed so dramatically across the West?
It's a lot of things. It's the housing crisis, as we've mentioned. It's the speculation, not only of housing, but of all aspects of the economy. It's privatization. It's people waking up and realize that actually the economy does not work for them anymore. And they see our elites driving us into more wars with Russia, Iran, and China. It is a boy who cried wolf situation. The big bad guy who was who's comparable to Hitler was Saddam Hussein, then it was Gaddafi, and then it was Bashar al-Assad, and it goes on and on and on. And people are realizing that actually, well, hang on, if we're declaring war with the Middle East, Iran, China, Russia, I mean, are we just not declaring war on the whole world? It's not just us versus the world. This is not what we signed up for. So people are waking up to that. They're waking up to the fact that our foreign policy is not only impeding our safety when we're sent off to fight and die in these wars. It's impeding our safety here at home because we have to pick up the pieces after they're done with their military adventures. It's all the peoples of those countries that flee to our country. And unfortunately carry out acts of vengeance against our people. And that's why we have huge crime rates. That is why we have an ever-present terror threat level. And now we've got the atrocities committed in Gaza, live streamed to our phones, and that's created a huge divorce between our mentality and the mentality of our rulers. It also makes barefaced the lie that we've gone into these countries with humanitarian ambitions, when so people are quite right to ask, well, hang on, where's our military campaign against Israel? We are seeing Israel commit a genocide live on our phones. But our government seems not only to not be willing to fight a war against Israel, but are actually best mates with Israel. Our diplomats are shaking hands with Israeli politicians and diplomats. It's our politicians that are treating the Israelis like royalty. And so people are sick of the lies. People know wholesale that our regime is not ruling in our best interests. And we see that with the wholesale rejection of mainstream parties. But now people need to understand that a lot of these alternative parties are not the answer either. They are establishment hacks as well. And so that's where we are at the moment. But it's not going to be too hard a job to do, because people do see that people like Nigel Farage or Zach Polanski are bowing to our establishment's agenda. Maybe different parts of the agenda, but it is all one agenda. So I'm very hopeful about the future. It's dark, but it always needs to get a bit darker before we see the dawn.
Has the internet permanently broken centralized narrative control?
I would say, like with every revolution of technology, it shifts the balance, but it doesn't actually finish the job. Our media is still too tightly controlled, and that does have consequences. Censorship is playing a role. So, the objective conditions are there, right? The rise of the internet has made it easier for us. It's just not going to do it for us. it's up to people like you and me to fight the info wars. It's up to us, like people like you and me, to finish the job. A greater space has been opened up, but if we slacken our efforts, we let our enemies have that space, and we let them give their narrative. It's like if my party, the Workers' Party, we stand in elections in Britain, and the other lefties say, well, why would you stand in elections? The whole electoral system is rigged against us. It's a set game. And I say, yes, but what happens when we don't stand in those elections? We're just making our enemy's job easier for them. It's very tough to fight elections against mainstream parties. We often lose these elections, but the very few occasions we win them, I mean, the victory is just infinitely more glorious because it creates a crisis in the enemy camp. But what would have happened in Rochdale had George Galloway not stood? What would have happened in Birmingham City Council had we not stood? We would have given all the ground to Reform and the Greens to have all the fun. And they can't have all the fun because they're not the anti-establishment force. But the moral of the story is that we need to do what we need to do. We need to set up our media channels. We need to grow on social media. We need to produce our own videos. We need to enlighten people on the issues of today, and stand in elections and make our voices heard, because if we don't, someone else will, and someone else often doesn't have the best interests of our people at heart.
Live from the other side, the feed is going dark.
Now, this next topic gets interesting. Throughout history, societies facing instability often create larger theories to explain how power operates. Secret societies, the Knights Templar, the Freemasons, the Illuminati. But the more important question is not whether one secret organization controls the world. The more important question is whether modern systems naturally evolve towards centralized control anyway. Because throughout history, institutions consistently move towards more surveillance, more bureaucracy, more optimization, and more authority during periods of instability. And now technology is accelerating that process dramatically. Artificial intelligence requires enormous concentrations of data, energy, infrastructure, and institutional coordination. Governments and major technology corporations are becoming increasingly intertwined. Algorithmic management expands, predictive systems expands, behavior monitoring expands, and suddenly modern society begins looking very similar to what the old conspiracy theories warned about, not because ancient secret societies planned it, but because technological civilization naturally rewards centralized systems. That's why conspiracy theories remain culturally powerful. They reflect deeper anxieties about power, control, and the growing instability of ordinary people to influence enormous technological systems. And today, many technology elites increasingly speak as though they are redesigning civilization itself. The world probably is not secretly controlled by a flawless ancient conspiracy. But despite institutional chaos and incompetence, civilization still drifts towards larger systems of technological management and centralized control. And with AI accelerating globally, that concern is no longer science fiction. Jesse, do technological systems naturally push societies towards civilization?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think this process of centralized control is not a conscious process, but as humanity develops a more sophisticated economy, then the economy takes on a life of its own. Really, it's Skynet, so to speak, and so the economy reproduces itself. It atomizes humanity into classes. Those classes perform their functions, and the system. And what human beings do is in a reaction to that process. The combination of, I was reading a bit of Adam Smith last night, and he talks about the combination of masters. So that would look like corporations, the amalgamation of different businesses into cartels, and also the combination of workers. So the establishment of trade unions, farmers cooperatives. All these are reaction to this centralized control. Now, centralized control, you could liken it to a bureaucracy, or even the term could be likened to a bureaucracy. They're almost synonyms, really. They're easily spoken of in a negative light, and indeed there are many negative aspects of those, especially when the people at the head of these of a bureaucracy or a centralized control don't operate in our interest. But people often forget that actually, as our needs develop, as the economy develops, these centralized control and bureaucracy is a necessity. So fundamentally, it's really a good thing that they exist. They just need to be operated to our benefit rather than against our benefit, or for the sole purpose of, as we were talking about, speculation and accumulation. You can't, as you say, you can't operate a sophisticated AI infrastructure without centralized control. You cannot operate large-scale healthcare systems or education systems without bureaucracy. All these things are a necessity, but actually, it's us as ordinary people that need to master how these bureaucracies function, so that they are rested in our interest and they function for our interest. Like, is Russia not a centralized? Not have a centralized bureaucracy? Does China not have centralized bureaucracy? Belarus, all these countries have centralized bureaucracies, but those bureaucracies are being used to reindustrialize their countries, or industrialize in the first place, to maximize consumer benefit, so people can buy more stuff and enjoy better lives, so that actually people spend less time at work and more time with family. These systems can be used to liberate us, but right now, especially in the West, they are being used to enslave us, and that's where the change needs to be made.
Why do you think conspiracy theories remain so powerful culturally?
I think because stories are very powerful. It's much easier to talk to people about that these things are set in motion because of a bad guy. That bad guy tends to be the Illuminati, the Freemasons, the Jews, the list goes on. And it's not right, because there are very real processes in the economy that leads to this centralization of bureaucracy. So let's just say, you were to take out the Illuminati, you were to take out the Jews, blah, blah, blah. Would these processes not function? Of course they would, because it's not a given identity of people that are putting all these processes in conscious development. It's a self-running motor that puts us into motion. And the problem is that we actually don't have conscious mastery over this motor. And unless we do so, then we're going to continue to see economic collapse, environmental catastrophe, war, and all the rest of it. So no, these groups don't set these things in motion. This is an economic process.
Are governments and major tech corporations becoming inseparable?
Yes, the collusion is there, and it's growing. I mean, this isn't anything new, really, in the sense that for time immemorial, since the dawn of the state, you've had powerful institutions. And to maximize effectiveness, these institutions had to operate under a nominal level of independence. You could go back to the feudal era and see the king, the church, different lords that control different parts of the land and different aspects of the state. That's all done in the name of the efficiency. You have the state itself, the state apparatus today, the modern state, and you have big private corporations and state security agencies that all run with a nominal level of independence, again, in the name of efficiency or market efficiency today. The notion of efficiency evolves and goes through an occasional rebrand. But yeah, new big tech companies are a very recent development in our civilization, and the state still hasn't really mastered the art of bringing those corporations under its control. They're under its control, but there's still again so much space to be occupied, and it's been occupied by normal people like you and me. So there is a process of the co-optation of these media corporations or big tech corporations, but it is an ongoing process, and the level of controlled ebbs and flows.
Does AI represent the beginning of a new technocratic era?
I don't think so. I think it's a revolutionary technology that will reshape how we live our day-to-day lives, and is reshaping our day-to-day lives. I can't really see how it deviates from previous technological revolutions that have altered our economy, that have caused levels of economic crises, and have shaped the way that we live our lives. It doesn't necessarily change the order of things, of how we have a combination of masters that are driven towards accumulation and our impoverishment. Now, these objective technological revolutions will go on, and they will cause disruption. It brings us closer to the point of where we attain our mastery over these sophisticated systems of centralized control and bureaucracy. But it requires our own independent action to master these processes. So AI isn't the beginning of that. Well, of that, but it is. But it does take us closer to that point. That is my take on AI. So it's big, it's dramatic, but it's not as big as dramatic as some people online would describe it.
From the other side, the feed is going dark.
Now let's move into geopolitics, because while most attention remains focused on Ukraine and the Middle East, another major geopolitical struggle is unfolding quietly in South America, and it revolves around lithium, which is increasingly becoming the oil of the 21st century. Bolivia holds some of the world's largest lithium reserves, a critical resource for electric vehicle batteries, energy storage systems, and future industrial supply chains. That makes Bolivia strategically important to both China and the United States. Under Evo Morales, Bolivia attempted to maintain strong state control over lithium development while partnering with foreign companies under conditions designed to preserve sovereignty. But following the 2019 political crisis and Morales' removal from power, accusations quickly emerged across Latin America that foreign interests were heavily involved because of Bolivia's strategic resources. Since then, Bolivia has become increasingly unstable again. Mass protests, economic crisis, political unrest, competing foreign interests. And now Bolivia finds itself trapped between larger power blocks competing for strategic minerals and future industrial dominance. This is the new resource war, not necessarily direct invasions, but supply chain competition, economic pressure, political instability, foreign influence. The green transition is not eliminating geopolitics, it is intensifying it. Because the future industrial system still depends on controlling physical resources, and countries sitting on those resources increasingly become geopolitical battlegrounds. Jesse, is lithium becoming the strategic equivalent of oil?
It is. It's the reason why oil is becoming such a strategically significant resource is because it has huge relevance to our lives. It's how we fuel our cars, and now lithium is going to be the ultimate fuel for our car if we continue down this road of net zero, which I, for one, am firmly opposed to. I really cannot see the ecological merit of net zero, especially when it's just instigating another resource war. And we have actually so much oil in the North Sea of Britain, and coal for that matter. The list goes on. So it is, and the geopolitical implications are severe. It is intensifying competition between the United States and the BRICS countries that are vying for control. Now, of course, my sympathy is more towards the BRICS countries, as it's the BRICS that aren't going around plundering the world and invading other countries. It's the BRICS that are trying to establish a mutually beneficial trade with other countries. Bolivia has a lot of lithium, but China has a lot of almost everything else. So there's lots of ways in which Bolivia and China could have traded quite peacefully, and we would have seen a good supply line of lithium. But that also depends on Britain's willingness to trade and deal in equal terms with China.
How much of modern geopolitics is now driven by supply chains and critical minerals?
It's determined by supply chains and critical minerals, but it's also, but to a large extent, it's also determined by speculation as well. All these new economies, if you look at Iraq, people say Iraq was invaded because of its oil, but actually, we also saw the most successful insurgency campaign in Iraq that really made oil extraction from Iraq nigh on impossible. So what was then the modus operandi of invading Iraq? It's the structural readjustment of the economy, the financialization of that economy to keep fueling this financial bubble that we have. So whilst securing resources is an important war goal of our military-industrial complex, so too is speculation on part of contractors abroad, speculation on property value inside the countries that we've just wrecked and destroyed and are now rebuilding in our neoliberal image. There are multiple ways that this imperialist world order is sustaining itself through these continual wars of destruction and plunder. But the means by which our military-industrial complex cash in on the spoils of war there's a multitude of means by which they do that.
So do you think the green transition is creating a new era of resource conflict?
It is. It's net zero is a total scam. Whilst ostensibly it might be cleaner at home, it offsets the vast ecological damage that lithium extraction promises. A bit like we see how clean air zones and low traffic neighborhoods are installed in rich areas, whereas it's the poor areas that have to absorb now most of the road traffic and the pollution that high traffic does. Like I love green stuff. I love cleaning up lakes. I love a vast, comprehensive public transport system. Like those are the green policies that I'm absolutely 100% behind. Bigger buses, cheaper buses, underground networks. Like I love all that stuff. But this net zero transition is a total scam. It's only going to promise more foreign wars, more struggle for resources. It makes no sense. I think the real green thing to do is actually drill our own North Sea oil, start digging coal back up again so that we actually build the industrial capacity for a nuclear energy revolution. That is the green project that I can get behind. Not this net zero madness that is only actually accelerating speculation and accumulation of our elites and promises even greater poverty for the white van men who keep this country going.
Is Bolivia becoming an example of how smaller nations get trapped between competing power blocks?
It is, but smaller countries also have more choice now. With the rise of BRICS, um, they they're given the opportunity, at least, to, not without their consequences. Obviously, Bolivia, falls under the Western Hemisphere, as does Venezuela, and now Cuba, which is undergoing a very perilous situation as we speak. So I'd rather be a country in sub-Saharan Africa than I would a Caribbean country in the Western Hemisphere, put it that way, as logistically it's a lot easier for the United States to decapitate the leadership of that country. But in any case, the rise of BRICS does present an alternative model of development for poor small countries, and more of them are being tempted to undergo, and as they should. It's a more peaceful, more sustainable mode of development, and one that actually prioritizes poverty alleviation of their people. Again, it's not without its risk, but the power of the United States is waning. Its power to enact regime change is diminishing. It's stuck in a quagmire in Iran. The war in Ukraine, the war against Russia, is not going anywhere. I don't know how they're going to find the capacity to try and decouple Taiwan from China, but they haven't even really made much of a start on that, I don't think. So these small countries, although it's still very risky, there is a new path of development which will, I think, be their salvation.
From the other side, the feed is going dark.
All right, let's finish with the most dangerous subject of all, because the international system increasingly appears trapped inside permanent escalation. Diplomacy is weakening, trust between major powers is collapsing, and every side increasingly believes the other side will eventually back down first. Historically, that mindset has often ended badly, both in Ukraine and the Middle East. Escalation itself increasingly appears to have replaced diplomacy. Every few months, another threshold is crossed. Long-range strikes, drone attacks, strategic infrastructure targeting, threats involving the Strait of Hormuz. And the truly dangerous part is how casually nuclear powers now operate around these risks. At the beginning of the Ukraine war, Western governments imposed significant escalation limits. Over time, many of those restrictions weakened. From Moscow's perspective, Western intelligence, targeting assistance, and deep strikes increasingly resemble direct confrontation with NATO itself. Whether people agree with Russia or not strategically matters less than perception. If Russian planners conclude that the homeland itself is under coordinated attack, pressure for retaliation increases. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, similar dynamics are emerging. Escalation replaces negotiation. Compromise becomes politically toxic. Every side frames the conflict as existential terms. And once compromise begins looking like surrender, escalation becomes the only politically survivable option. That is what makes the current international environment so dangerous. Not necessarily deliberate pursuit of world war, but the gradual normalization of escalation among powers that increasingly no longer trust diplomacy. Jesse, has diplomacy between major powers effectively collapsed?
On the one hand, it's collapsed. But on the other hand, we are seeing more cohesion with major powers. But it's the pole of division is between the NATO powers and BRICS powers. That is the new Cold War that we see today. There are different theaters of conflict. I think the West has done has an interesting strategy of have the European Union focus on the war in Ukraine, whereas the United States can focus on Iran and countries in the Western Hemisphere. So the propaganda in our countries is towing the same line, but the emphasis is different. In Europe, the emphasis is on Russia and so-called Putin, and in the United States, it's the narco-terrorism of Venezuela, and it's the and it's the terrorist sponsor of Iran, so it's called. These are the different narratives that are being spoon-fed to our populations in the different countries. So it was good to see Trump speak with Putin, but I've lost optimism of that, as this wasn't imperialism withdrawing from Ukraine. This was imperialism reorganizing itself in different theaters of conflict. So there is, so unfortunately, the drive to war is still ongoing. And it's only going to get worse as time goes on. The real battle now is within the countries, within belligerent countries such as ours in Britain. And that is why it's so important for the people inside those countries, for people in the United States, to speak out against the war machine, to support mavericks in the political system like Thomas Massey, Dan Bilzerian in the States, and in Britain. I'm very proud to now be taking a leading organizing role in the No to NATO campaign. In Britain, we're seeing people back independent community groups in these elections now. And so the pole of resistance in belligerent countries is growing. We did see a setback in Hungary, but we're also seeing a comeback in Bulgaria. So the battle is ebbing and flowing, but that is another pole of division that exists in the belligerent countries. So settling the score with our elites, I don't think is not going to be a peaceful process. There is no negotiation with this lot. Russia tried that for 8 years following the Euromaidan coup, but they could only be taken for fools for so long before the gloves had to be taken off and the special military operation being launched. And the special military operation was not a war of conquest. I mean, the biggest voices for the special military operation before it even started came from the left. It came from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. It was the right-wingers who were trying to look for a more peaceful solution. And now Putin is continuing to look for a diplomatic solution at great political risk to himself. If I'm not mistaken, I believe this is the biggest cause of resentment of the Russian population against Putin, is that Putin has not been fighting it. It's not that Putin had launched a special military operation, but he has not seen it through with as much thoroughness as they believe he ought to.
Yeah. Are Western governments underestimating how Russia perceives deep strikes inside its territory?
They are. As I mentioned, Putin is under tremendous tremendous pressure from his population. Is under tremendous pressure from his population to see this war through. And the more the West gives him a reason to squeeze the trigger ever harder, he will do it. He will do it. He's not going to sit back and let his magnanimity be taken advantage of. So our rulers are playing a very stupid game of trying to provoke Russia into a war, because let me be very clear, it's going to be a hell of a sell by Trump, as good of a salesman as he is, to try and win the Americans over to a war against Russia. Spoiler alert, it'll never happen. I don't think the Americans will ever condone a war against Russia, at least no one outside of New York City or Boston, but it'll be the EU that will be left out in the cold. After all, it was the EU countries, particularly Britain, that had to establish under our Premier Keir Starmer's own leadership a coalition of the willing, of people who were steadfast. Again, very stupid, because Keir Starmer had to backtrack from that and said, well, we can only continue this if America puts a backstop on. So, that shows how how sure the coalition of the willing were to keep it up against Russia. Because let's be clear, if the EU does initiate a full-scale war against Russia, Russia will be the victorious party in this war. As I said, Russia has industrial capacity. Russia can make tens of thousands of guns to arm swathes of the population. The EU cannot do that. The EU doesn't have industrial capacity. It doesn't even need to assemble its own army. It exhausted its supply lines just to arm the Ukrainian army. How the hell is it going to arm its respective armies? You could fit the armed forces of Britain in a football stadium, a small one at that. I live in Wolverhampton. You could fit them all in Molineux Stadium. You know, so the idea that we are in any way prepared for a war against Russia is ludicrous. We're even less prepared since the launch of the special military operation in 2022 because we've exhausted our supply lines. And now the government wants to enact conscription in Britain. Well, good luck with that.
Why has escalation become politically easier than compromise?
Well, compromise would entail as I was saying, this trajectory of a speculative economy the bubble's going to burst. And when our war machine is stopped in its tracks, that's when the bubble will burst. It needs new lands, it needs new terrain it's a parasite economy. And what happens to a parasite when it doesn't have a host? It dies. Our elite cannot afford to compromise. Our elites are. There's a famous fable of a man stuck in the desert, but with a poison chalice. He either dies of thirst in the desert, or he drinks a poison chalice and dies of poison. Personally, if I was in that situation, I'd probably just drink the poison and have done with it. And I think that's what the elites are doing now. They're not waging war because they're greedy. They're waging war because they have to, because the whole political power rests upon continual war. People look at, people skeptical of Zionist influence in their countries look to Hitler and Nazi Germany as answers, but people don't understand that it was the Third Reich that was a country in perpetual crisis. If Hitler had not enacted his wars of domination and conquest and plunder, the whole edifice would have collapsed on top of itself. And that is exactly what is happening to our ruling elite today with neoliberal war economies.
So what concerns you most about the current trajectory between NATO, Russia, Iran, and the wider international system?
My concern is that we're headed towards World War III, and it's no longer hyperbole. People are seeing it around the corner. But the question really is how we are going to react to it. And that's the key question, because the objective conditions for war are there. That's not in dispute. I choose not to dwell on it. I choose to act on it. And that is why people in countries such as ours need to get active, need to go out on protests, need to organize locally, because that's the only way that we're actually going to take our countries away from the brink of war, stop conscription in its tracks. I mean, look at what the French do on the streets of Paris during the Yellow Vest protest. Look at how they ransack government buildings. Just as people organized locally during the COVID pandemic scam, mass enforced vaccinations. This was a terrible time of state overreach and state tyranny, but it was also a beautiful time of community solidarity. And that is exactly what needs to be enacted when soldiers now come to our towns and communities to conscript young men and women to fight in these wars. It's our communities that can come together and stop this. Workers have the power to stop war. We just need to exercise our power, and it will all come tumbling down. After the after the Russian Revolution, the British armed the Jolly George ship to go to Russia. It was workers that struck and refused to send armaments to Russia, and it's Italian dock workers more recently who stopped arms shipments to Israel to be used for the genocide in Gaza. That's only a modicum of what we can exercise. You know, I'm a proud member of the RMT. The RMT unionized 4 out of the 5 ports, main ports that go into Britain. You know, the RMT just needs to pass a motion and actually get its organizers and activists to, you know, strangle the economy. But by the way, it doesn't work for us. It works for the elite. Like that's what we need to do to stop this war, and it can be done. It just depends on whether we have the will and the indefatigability to act on our power.
From the other side, the feed is going dark.
Okay. Thank you, Jesse, for tonight, for being on the show. Last words from you, anything?
Guys, like I said, I've made several calls to action for you. You know, keep watching Dave's channel from the other side. Don't buy into the propaganda. You know, read books, read about what the elites are talking to you about. When they're talking to you about Iran, read about Iran. When they're talking to you about Ukraine, read about Ukraine. Understand the history, and you'll find the connections. And when you have that knowledge, don't just sit on the knowledge. You know, spread the word, spread your message, and build the resistance. Knock on doors, get involved in your local politics, because that's the only way that things are going to get a change. You know, speak to your church, your mosque. You know, speak to your trade union. Just stay active, and that's how we build the resistance.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave.
All right, everybody, that's going to wrap up live show 177, The Power Convergence. Of course, a huge thank you to Jessie from No to NATO for joining us tonight and helping break down some of the major geopolitical, economic and technological developments now reshaping the global system. Tonight we covered the growing instability inside Western economies, the expansion of censorship and information control, the rise of technocratic systems and artificial intelligence, the geopolitical struggle over strategic resources like lithium, and the increasingly dangerous escalation dynamics unfolding between NATO, Russia, Iran, China, and the wider international order. And I think it's one of those things that's become increasingly clear when you step back and look at all these stories together. None of these crises are isolated anymore. Economic systems, technological systems, military systems, political systems, media systems, and energy systems are all beginning to converge in one large period of global instability and restructuring. The world order that dominated the last 30 years is visibly fracturing in real time, and the people running these systems increasingly look like they are improvising from crisis to crisis while hoping nobody notices the structural problems underneath. So as always, thank you to everybody watching live from around the world. Please support the channel, share the stream, subscribe if you haven't already, and check out tonight's sponsor, the Quantum Hemispheres, The Rise of Arco, available on Amazon. And remember, the further systems drift from reality, the more aggressively they try to manage perception. Good night, everybody, and we'll see you next time live from Minsk, Belarus.
Red lines on the digital map, wait for the signal to snap. Red lines on the digital map, wait for the signal to snap. Live from the other side, the feed is